Welcome to my channel.
The sky over Loch Dubh was an aggressive, cloudless blue, the air so bitterly cold it felt like a physical slap. Frost thickly crusted the heather, turning the hills into a sparkling, treacherous expanse of white and silver. It was a perfect, crystalline morning, entirely unsuited for police work. Constable Hamish Macbeth sat on a frost-hardened boulder high above the village, his large hands wrapped around a thermos cup of scalding, muddy coffee. His lanky frame was bundled in his heavy police greatcoat, his flaming red hair stuffed under his peaked cap. Beside him, his mongrel dog, Lugs, was enthusiastically trying to excavate a frozen rabbit hole, his tail wagging a steady rhythm against the icy turf. Hamish sighed happily, a long plume of white vapour escaping his lips. His stomach gave a quiet rumble, reminding him that the hotel might soon be serving a warm, heavy breakfast. The police station was locked, the radio was conveniently turned down to a barely audible whisper, and the ever-angry DCI Blair was safely 50 miles away in Strathbane. Hamish had a piece of poaching wire deep in his pocket purely for emergencies, of course signed every intention of spending the morning legally admiring the scenery. Then, the shouting started. The sharp acoustic of the frozen loch carried the sound perfectly. Hamish peered down at the village waterfront. Marching along the icy promenade was a man clad in blindingly bright, squeaking Gore-Tex, followed by a miserable-looking huddle of tourists. This was Marcus Thorne. The Sassenach had arrived in Loch Dubh a fortnight ago, not in the usual flashy saloon car, but leading a chartered bus of clients for his newly established authentic Highland survival retreat. Thorne had bought up the old Mac Lean Croft and immediately set about annoying every permanent resident within a 5-mile radius with his loud voice, his endless money, and his absolute certainty that he knew how to be a Highlander better than the Highlanders did. I specifically requested locally foraged sea buckthorn for the cleanse. Thorne's booming, aristocratic English accent shattered the morning peace. He was jabbing a gloved finger toward Mrs. Wellington, the village shopkeeper, who stood on her step looking entirely unimpressed. My clients are paying a premium for raw, untamed Scotland, not this commercially packaged rubbish, Mrs. Wellington crossed her arms, the biting wind entirely ignored. It's a tin of peaches, Mr. Thorne. Take it or leave it. The delivery lorry doesn't come up the pass when it's iced over. Hamish drained the last bitter dregs of his coffee and mourned the loss of his lazy morning. If he let Thorne continue, Mrs. Wellington would likely brain the man with a frozen turnip, and that would mean paperwork. A murder investigation was a terrible way to ruin a Tuesday, especially when it might draw the attention of headquarters and threaten Hamish with the one thing he feared most: promotion. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish murmured, pulling himself up to his full, towering height. "Let's go look wonderfully stupid." He ambled down the steep, slippery path with practiced ease, his gait loose and deceptively slow. By the time he reached the waterfront, his face had settled into an expression of bovine vacancy. "Mornin', Mrs. Wellington," Hamish drawled, touching the brim of his cap. He turned a mild, sleepy gaze toward Thorne. "Is there a wee bit of a problem here, sir? You're making an awful racket, and the sheep are trying to sleep." Thorne wheeled around, his face flushed red above his bright yellow collar. "Constable!" "Finally, I am trying to provision my retreat, and the local supply chain is completely inadequate. You people have no concept of commerce. I demand to know where I can source wild-caught salmon and artisanal greens immediately." Hamish let his mouth hang open just a fraction of an inch, staring at Thorne as if the man were speaking a complex dialect of Mandarin. Internally, Hamish noted the frantic, nervous energy of the Sassenach. Thorne's eyes darted around entirely too much for a man simply annoyed about groceries, and there was a faint, dark smear on the cuff of his pristine yellow jacket that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Well now," Hamish said slowly, scratching his ear, "if it's the greens you're wanting, I think old Angus has some cabbage left over from October. As for the salmon, the fish van comes on Thursday, usually." Thorne let out a loud, theatrical groan of frustration, turning back to his shivering clients. "Unbelievable. This whole village is stuck in the Dark Ages. Come along, team. We'll forage our own breakfast on the tundra." Hamish watched them march away, their expensive boots slipping comically on the ice. He didn't smile, though Lugs let out a low, speculative growl. Marcus Thorne was making enemies in Loch Dubh faster than a fox in a henhouse, and Hamish had a very cold, uncomfortable feeling in his gut that had nothing to do with the winter air. "He's a loud one, that, Mrs. Wellington noted, picking up her tin of peaches. "Someone's going to feed him to the loch before the week is out, Hamish." "Aye," Hamish agreed softly, his sharp hazel eyes tracking the Sassenachs retreating back. "Let's just hope they have the decency to wait until I've had my breakfast." Hamish retreated to the welcoming warmth of the Tommel Castle Hotel, his long legs carrying him directly toward the dining room and the promise of a massive, heavily fried breakfast. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, old carpets, and sizzling bacon, a comforting combination that instantly soothed his chilled bones. Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, wordlessly slid a steaming plate of eggs, black pudding, and thick-cut bacon onto the table, the moment Hamish folded his lanky frame into a corner booth. For 20 glorious minutes, the universe was in perfect harmony. Hamish ate with slow, methodical dedication, lugs resting heavily across his boots under the table, waiting for the inevitable scrap of sausage. The constable had just raised his second cup of coffee, contemplating a deeply peaceful afternoon of doing absolutely nothing beside the station stove, when the hotel's heavy oak doors banged open with the force of a winter gale. A woman stumbled into the lobby, her face the colour of old porridge. It was one of Marcus Thorne's wilderness clients, wearing a violently pink fleece that clashed terribly with her blue, trembling lips. She leaned against the doorframe, gasping for air, her expensive hiking boots caked in frozen mud. Hamish closed his eyes for a brief, tragic moment, mourning the sudden death of his quiet Tuesday. He carefully set his coffee cup down, his face instantly adopting a look of mild, slightly dim-witted concern as he ambled over to the hysterical woman. Now, lassie," Hamish drawled, his Highland lilt thick and soothing. "Catch your breath. Has the wild haggis given you a fright? It's Marcus," she shrieked, pointing a shaking, gloved finger back toward the steep path leading to the old Maclean croft. "Mr. Torner. He's in the woods. He's dead. Oh, it's horrible." Hamish let out a long, slow breath. "Right then," he murmured, his stomach giving a resentful twinge. He pulled his heavy greatcoat back on, signalling for lugs to follow. The bright, biting morning had already begun to turn. A thick, icy fog was rolling in off the loch, swallowing the aggressive blue sky and turning the landscape into a murky, featureless grey. It was the kind of creeping mist that chilled a man right to his marrow, dampening sound and making the familiar shapes of the village look strange and threatening. The hike up to the Maclean croft was a miserable, slippery affair. The surviving client, whose name was apparently Fiona, babbled incoherently the entire way, while Hamish nodded slowly, saying "Aye, and is that a fact?" at appropriate intervals. When they finally reached the small clearing behind the ruined stone walls of the croft, Hamish stopped dead in his tracks. He had to bite the inside of his cheek to stop a highly unprofessional bark of laughter from escaping. Marcus Thorne, the great survivalist and conqueror of the wilderness, was dangling entirely upside down from the thick branch of an ancient oak tree. He had apparently been caught in one of his own crude, supposedly authentic rope snares. His bright yellow Gore-Tex jacket had written up, exposing a pale expanse of thermal underwear, and his face, purple and horribly swollen from the blood rushing to his head, stared blindly at the frosted earth. He looked like a gigantic, very angry lemon suspended in mid-air. Hamish scratched his nose, his posture slumped and utterly relaxed as he surveyed the humiliating scene. Fiona wailed and covered her eyes. To any outsider, the village bobby looked completely overwhelmed, staring vacantly at the dangling corpse. But beneath the brim of his peaked cap, Hamish's sharp hazel eyes were missing nothing. He noticed that the frost beneath Thorne was completely undisturbed, save for a few neat, singular impressions. There were no frantic kick marks, no signs of a wild struggle from a man suddenly yanked off his feet. Thorne hadn't triggered this trap by accident while walking. He had been dead, or at least deeply unconscious, before he was hoisted up into the branches. Furthermore, the dark smear Hamish had spotted earlier on Thorne's yellow cuff was now accompanied by a massive congealed injury at the back of his skull, mostly hidden by his ridiculous collar. Most glaringly, the heavy, ostentatious survival knife Thorne had been wearing on his belt down in the village was entirely missing from its leather sheath. "Well, lugs," Hamish whispered to the dog, who was thoroughly investigating a nearby bush with supreme indifference to the dead Sassenach. "It seems our Mr. Thorne found the Highland wildlife a bit more aggressive than he bargained for." Hamish sighed, a deep, weary sound echoing in the heavy fog. He knew exactly what this meant. He would have to return to the police station, unlock the doors, and use the radio. He would have to call headquarters. Within a few hours, the piece of Loch Dubh would be entirely obliterated by the screeching sirens and thundering boots of Detective Chief Inspector Blair and his squad of heavy-handed detectives from Strathbane. Hamish dreaded Blair's arrival more than he dreaded a toothache, but there was no helping it now. Murder had come to Loch Dubh, and Hamish Macbeth's lazy week was officially, irredeemably ruined. Hamish deposited a still weeping Fiona into the capable, if slightly rough, hands of Mrs. Wellington at the village shop, instructing the matriarch to pour a generous measure of medicinal whiskey down the woman's throat. Then, with a heavy heart and dragging footsteps, he made his way to the police station. The icy fog had thickened, swallowing the mountains entirely and reducing Loch Dubh to a muffled, ghostly outpost. Inside the station, the stove was blessedly warm, but the comfort was entirely ruined by the necessity of picking up the radio microphone. He reported the corpse with agonizing slowness, enduring the crackling, disbelieving squawk of the Strathbane dispatcher. Afterward, he slumped into his chair, fed Lugs a slightly stale digestive biscuit, and waited for the inevitable storm, mourning the quiet life he had enjoyed just an hour prior. The tranquility of the frosted loch was brutally murdered an hour later by the shrieking wail of sirens. 3 battered police rovers came skidding recklessly out of the grey mist, their tyres violently crunching over the iced-over puddles on the waterfront. There were no sleek executive cars for the Strathbane CID, only mud-splattered vehicles driven by men who were already furious about being dragged out into the freezing cold. The passenger door of the lead rover swung open with a violent metallic groan, and Detective Chief Inspector Blair hauled his immense, barrel-chested bulk into the biting Highland air. Blair's face was already a spectacular shade of mottled magenta, a permanent state of rage exacerbated by the chill and the mere existence of his least favourite subordinate. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice tearing through the fog like a foghorn. He marched toward the station, breathing heavily, smelling strongly of stale cigarette smoke, peppermint antacids, and raw aggression. "Where are you, you lanky, useless streak of misery?" Hamish stepped out of the station, his face a perfect mask of slow-witted bewilderment. He touched the brim of his cap. "Right here, sir. It's an awful cold day to drive, isn't it?" "I've got the kettle on if you're wanting to thaw out before we shut your mouth, you idle Highland peasant," Blair snapped, stopping inches from Hamish to glare up at him. "I'm not here for a tea party. Where is the body? And why haven't you secured the scene, you gormless idiot?" "It's up by the old Maclean Croft, sir," Hamish drawled, his voice painfully slow. "It's quite secure, seeing as the gentleman is currently hanging upside down from an oak tree. I didn't want to go cutting him down and disturbing your evidence, sir." Blair's eyes bulged. He turned to his trailing detectives, Anderson and Higgins, who looked equally miserable in their thin city coats. "Rah! Lead the way, Macbeth, and try to move faster than a glacier." The trek back up the slippery, frost-hardened incline was a comical disaster for the Strathbane men. Blair cursed with every breath, his slick-soled shoes finding zero purchase on the icy mud, while Hamish strolled upward with the effortless, annoying grace of a mountain goat. By the time they reached the ruined croft, Blair was wheezing like a broken accordion. He stopped, staring at the bright yellow, upside-down spectacle of Marcus Thorne. "Good God!" Blair panted, wiping a mixture of sweat and freezing mist from his forehead. "What kind of savage medieval nonsense is this?" "Looks like one of his own survival snares, sir," Hamish offered gently, leaning against a ruined stone wall. "Though I noticed his big fancy hunting knife is missing from his belt, and there's a fair bit of blood on the back of his head that didn't come from the rope. Did I ask for your entirely worthless opinion, Macbeth?" Blair roared, his face darkening to a dangerous purple. "I have eyes! It's perfectly obvious what happened here. This rich Sassenach comes up here flashing his money around, playing survivalist. One of your thieving, inbred locals decided to relieve him of his expensive gear. They hit him from behind, string him up to make it look like an accident with his own trap, and steal his knife and wallet." Hamish let his jaw drop slightly, looking deeply confused. "But, sir, if they wanted his wallet, why did they leave his fancy gold watch on his wrist? And I don't think a local would do exactly what I tell you they would do," Blair shouted, entirely dismissing the logic. "It's that degenerate poacher, Dougal MacCallum. He hates the English, and he's always prowling these woods. Anderson! Higgins! Get this man cut down! Macbeth, since you are entirely incapable of basic police work, get out of my way. Go down to the village and start taking statements. And don't you dare try to think, Macbeth, leave the detection to the real policeman." Hamish touched his cap again, hiding a flicker of sharp satisfaction behind his vacant eyes. "Aye, sir, as you say." He turned and ambled back into the icy fog, Lugs trotting happily at his heels, entirely free to begin his own quiet investigation. The descent back into Loch Dubh was significantly more pleasant than the climb up, largely because the thick, freezing fog muffled the sound of DCI Blair's ongoing temper tantrum. Hamish strolled at a remarkably relaxed pace, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his greatcoat, Lugs trotting faithfully at his heels, with a distinctly smug expression. The village was already buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Curtains twitched in the stone cottages along the waterfront, and the few brave souls venturing out into the biting chill immediately hurried toward the nerve centre of all local intelligence. Mrs. Wellington's shop! Hamish, deciding that formal police procedure required immediate caloric reinforcement, made the shop his first destination. The bell above the door jingled merrily, a stark contrast to the grim business of murder, as Hamish pushed his way into the comforting warmth. The air smelled of paraffin heaters, damp wool, and the sharp tang of cheap citrus sweets. Mrs. Wellington was holding court behind the counter, a steaming mug of tea already waiting by the till, clearly anticipating her favourite, if officially useless, local constable. "It's a terrible business, Hamish," she announced, before he had even fully closed the door, sliding a plate of slightly stale fruit scones toward him. "A terrible business entirely. Though I can't say I didn't warn him. A man who shouts at a tin of peaches is tempting fate." Hamish offered a slow, appreciative nod, wrapping his large, cold hands around the mug of tea. "Aye, it's a dark day for tourism," he murmured, taking a massive bite of a scone. "Poor Mr. Thorn has managed to get himself tangled up in his own cleverness. The Strathbane men are up there now, shouting at the trees. Mr. Blair is utterly convinced Dougal MacCallum strung the man up for his expensive boots." Mrs. Wellington let out a snort that could have easily startled a horse. Dougal MacCallum wouldn't string up a squirrel if it required more than 5 minutes of sustained effort. Besides, Dougal was in my back parlour until midnight last night, trying to mend my husband's radio to pay off his tab. No, Hamish, if you're looking for the man who put a knot in that Sassenach's rope, you shouldn't be looking at our own. Hamish stopped chewing, his hazel eyes losing their sleepy glaze for just a fraction of a second. "Is that a fact?" he asked mildly, adopting a look of profound bovine stupidity. "And who should I be looking at, then?" Mrs. Wellington leaned across the counter, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "One of his own pampered survivalists. Mr. Harrison. The thin man looks like he's never eaten carbohydrates in his life. Last night, just after the pub called Last Orders, they were having a blazing row around the back of the hotel. I was putting the bins out. Harrison was waving his arms, furious, screaming that Thorn was a fraud. Said the whole estate purchase was a sham and that Thorn had stolen his seed money. Thorn just laughed at him. A very cruel, nasty sort of laugh. Hamish swallowed his tea, the pieces clicking together in his mind with the precision of a well-oiled lock. Blair was currently tearing through the heather looking for a local poacher, entirely ignoring the furious, shivering clients huddled down in the village. It was a classic Blair mistake, driven by prejudice and an absolute refusal to look past the end of his own bulbous nose. Hamish thanked Mrs. Wellington, slipping a coin into the honesty box for the scones, and stepped back out into the dreary grey afternoon. The Tommel Castle Hotel was only a short walk down the promenade, its windows glowing with a buttery, inviting light against the gloom. Inside, the surviving members of the authentic Highland survival retreat were clustered around the massive stone fireplace in the lounge, looking distinctly unauthentic as they clutched glasses of hot toddy. Hamish ambled into the room, his shoulders slouched, looking every inch the bumbling country copper who was entirely out of his depth. He scanned the miserable faces until he spotted him, a reedy, sharp-featured man with thinning hair staring intensely into the flames. Hamish shuffled, removing his cap with exaggerated awkwardness. "Excuse me, sir," he drawled, his voice thick with Highland hesitation. "I'm awful sorry to interrupt your warming up, Constable Macbeth. I am just having to ask a few wee questions, seeing as the big city detectives are busy up the hill. You wouldn't happen to be Mr. Harrison, would you?" The thin man jumped, his eyes darting toward Hamish with sudden, undisguised panic. He gripped his glass so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. "Yes, I am. What of it? I've already told your superiors everything I know, which is nothing." "Oh, I am sure, Hamish soothed, looking vacantly at the ceiling. "It's just, you see, it's a dreadful puzzle. Mr. Thorn's lovely big hunting knife has gone missing, the one he was flashing about yesterday. I don't suppose you saw it, sir? Only, a wee bird mentioned you two were having a rather loud disagreement last night, and I wouldn't want Mr. Blair thinking you had any reason to borrow it." Harrison swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing its way down his pale temple despite the draughty room. Hamish stood perfectly still, offering a gentle, entirely empty smile, patiently waiting for the Sassenach to make a fatal mistake. Harrison's Adam's apple bobbed convulsively in his thin throat. I don't know anything about a knife, he stammered, his gaze dropping to the threadbare carpet before darting nervously toward the lounge's heavy velvet curtains. Marcus and I had a minor disagreement regarding the itinerary. That was the entirety of it. I went straight to my room immediately after and locked the door. I haven't the faintest idea what your local gossips think they heard. Hamish blinked slowly, letting out a long, disappointed sigh that made him look like a very tired, very slow bloodhound. He did not miss the fact that Harrison's right hand, clutching the glass of hot toddy, bore a fresh, jagged scratch across the knuckles, the sort of scratch a man might get from struggling with a rough hemp rope or tearing through frosted brambles in the dark. "Ah, the itinerary," Hamish repeated, his tone entirely devoid of sarcasm. "Of course, sir. It's just an awful shame how the wind carries voices across the loch. Sometimes a friendly chat about schedules sounds terribly like a man shouting about stolen seed money and fraudulent estates. The acoustics in Loch Dubh are a terrible burden to us all." Harrison opened his mouth to protest, a defensive sneer forming on his pale lips, but he was interrupted by the brisk opening of the lounge doors. A blast of freezing, fog-dampened air swept into the room, bringing with it a figure who instantly commanded the attention of everyone present. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped into the warmth, looking utterly immaculate in her tailored winter tweeds. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, entirely unaffected by the Highland chill, and her aristocratic features held an expression of cool, polite detachment. She scanned the room, her sharp blue eyes flicking over the huddled, miserable survivalists before settling on the towering, slouching figure of the local policeman. Unlike the city folk, Priscilla knew exactly how sharp the mind was beneath that mess of flaming red hair. She offered a crisp nod and walked purposefully toward him. "Constable Macbeth," Priscilla said, her clear, upper-class voice easily slicing through the low murmur of the room. "I was hoping I might find you here. I need a word regarding a matter of trespassing on my father's estate. If you could spare a moment from your interrogations." "Aye, Miss Halberton Smythe," Hamish drawled, touching his cap with exaggerated deference. He gave Harrison one last, empty smile. "I'll be right back to you, sir. Don't go wandering off into the fog now." He followed Priscilla out of the lounge and into a quiet, shadowed alcove near the hotel reception desk. The moment they were out of earshot, the haughty aristocrat act vanished, replaced by a conspiratorial gleam in her eye. "Trespassing, is it?" Hamish murmured, leaning against the wood-panelled wall. "Your father hasn't been up to the estate since September, Priscilla." "Never mind my father," she whispered, stepping closer so her voice wouldn't carry. "I heard about Marcus Thorne. The whole village is talking about it. Mrs. Wellington says DCI Blair is currently tearing up the hillside looking for Dougal MacCallum, which means Blair is being his usual spectacularly incompetent self. You have a terrible lack of respect for my superior officers," Hamish sighed, though a genuine spark of amusement warmed his chest. "But he's barking up the wrong tree entirely. I was just having a lovely chat with Mr. Harrison there. I think he might have helped Thorne find his sudden interest in acrobatics." Priscilla shook her head. "It's not just Harrison you need to worry about, Hamish. You need to understand who these people actually are. I recognized the name Marcus Thorne the moment he arrived. My father met him at his club in London 2 months ago. Thorne was entirely bankrupt. Utterly ruined." Hamish straightened up slightly, his posture losing a fraction of its carefully cultivated slouch. "Bankrupt? But he bought the Mac Lean Croft for cash. And he's got all this fancy gear. It's a front," Priscilla explained, her eyes serious. "The authentic wilderness retreat was a desperate final gamble. And those clients in there? They aren't just tourists paying for a holiday. They're his creditors. He convinced them to invest in this absurd venture to recoup the massive losses he caused them in the city. He dragged them up here to prove the business was viable, but they must have realized it was a sham. Any one of them had a motive to string him up once they saw the state of the croft and realized their money was gone forever." Hamish rubbed his jaw, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly shifting and rearranging themselves into a much clearer, darker picture. The motive wasn't just a petty argument, it was financial ruin. Harrison was the most likely candidate, given the scratch and the argument, but Priscilla had just widened the net. "You are a grand help, Priscilla," Hamish said softly, genuinely grateful. "Though I'd appreciate it if you kept this quiet. If Blair finds out these folks are wealthy investors, he'll trip over himself trying to bow to them, and hell arrest Dougal just to keep the paperwork tidy." "My lips are sealed," she promised, offering a rare, genuine smile. "But how are you going to prove it before Blair makes an arrest?" "I need the murder weapon," Hamish replied, his gaze drifting toward the fog-shrouded window. "Thorne's hunting knife is missing. A city man panicking in the dark doesn't carry a bloody knife back to his hotel room. He hides it. And I need to find out where a frightened Sassenach would throw a piece of stolen steel on a freezing Highland night." Hamish bid Priscilla a polite farewell, tipping his cap with a reassuring wink before pushing his way back out through the heavy oak doors of the Tommel Castle Hotel. The afternoon had completely surrendered to the freezing fog, turning the world beyond the hotel's glowing windows into a damp, white purgatory. It was the sort of weather that seeped right through a heavy police greatcoat and settled stubbornly in a man's bones. Lugs whined softly, leaning against Hamish's leg for warmth. I know, it's a miserable business," Hamish murmured to the dog, his breath pluming in the icy air. "But if we don't find that knife before DCI Blair finds a functioning brain cell, poor Dougal MacCallum will be spending the winter in a Strathbane cell." Hamish set off along the shoreline path, his long, unhurried strides eating up the distance between the hotel and the steep track leading up to the Maclean Croft. He tried to put himself in the expensive, slippery boots of a panicked Londoner. You have just bludgeoned your fraudulent host, dragged him into his own rope snare, and you are running blindly down a pitch-black, frost-slicked hillside. Your heart is pounding, you are terrified of the dark, and your hand is wrapped around a bloodied survival knife. Where do you put it? You wouldn't keep it. A city man would want to be rid of the weapon instantly. You wouldn't throw it in the loch from the shore, the water was too shallow at the edge, and a shiny piece of steel would be visible by morning light. You needed deep, fast-moving water, or a very deep hole. A sudden sharp whistle cut through the muffled silence of the fog. Hamish paused, his hand instinctively dropping to the pocket containing his poaching wire, though he knew perfectly well who was lurking in the mist. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the old village smokehouse. It was Dougal MacCallum, smelling strongly of wood smoke, wet wool, and illicitly trapped rabbit. The poacher looked unusually agitated, his ferret-like face pinched with cold and worry. "Afternoon, Hamish," Dougal hissed, darting a nervous glance up the road. "Mrs. Wellington sent her boy down to tell me that a large, red-faced gorilla from Strathbane is tearing up the heather looking for me. Says I strung up that loudmouth Sassenach." "He does indeed, Dougal," Hamish said mildly, leaning against the damp stone wall of the smokehouse. "Mr. Blair has a very high opinion of your knot-tying skills. I'd strongly suggest you make yourself scarce. Go visit your sister in Brakey for a few days." "I am not running from a crime I didn't commit," Dougal spat indignantly, though his eyes kept darting nervously toward the sound of distant shouting up on the hill. "I was in Mrs. Wellington's parlour until midnight, fixing that blasted radio. But I'll tell you this for nothing, Hamish. When I was walking home, crossing the old stone bridge over the Corrie Burn, I saw someone coming down from the croft. Moving fast, tripping over their own feet like a drunken sheep." Hamish's lazy demeanour vanished entirely, his sharp eyes locking onto the poacher. "Did you see who it was?" "Too dark, and they had a flashlight waving all over the place," Dougal replied, rubbing his frozen hands together. "But they stopped dead in the middle of the bridge. Heard a splash, like they chucked a heavy stone into the burn. Then they scurried off toward the hotel." Hamish let out a slow, satisfied breath. The Corrie Burn was a fast, vicious little stream that cut a deep gorge just before it emptied into the loch. It rarely froze over completely because of the rushing current. It was the perfect place to dispose of a bloody hunting knife. "You're a good man, Dougal," Hamish said softly. "Now take my advice. Go to Brakey. Let me handle the heavy lifting." Leaving the poacher to vanish back into the mist, Hamish directed his long strides toward the stone bridge. The sound of rushing water grew louder, a dull roar cutting through the heavy fog. When he reached the low stone parapet, he leaned over, peering down into the churning, icy black water below. The steep banks of the burn were thickly crusted with ice and tangled with dead, thorny gorse bushes. "Right, lugs," Hamish sighed, contemplating the thoroughly miserable task ahead of him. "We're going to have to get our feet wet." He scrambled clumsily down the slippery bank, cursing quietly under his breath as a thorny branch tore at his uniform trousers. He reached the water's edge, balancing precariously on a frost-heaved rock that threatened to pitch him into the freezing current. He swept his gaze along the shoreline, looking for any snag, submerged root, or shallow pool where a heavy blade might have caught before being swept out into the depths of the loch. Just as the bone-deep chill began to numb his toes entirely through his heavy leather boots, he spotted a flash of unnatural colour caught in a tangle of frozen reeds just below the bridge arch. It wasn't the metallic gleam of the knife itself, but a torn, jagged piece of bright yellow Gore-Tex fabric, the exact same waterproof material as Marcus Thorne's garish jacket. And tangled right beside it, resting precariously on a submerged shelf of ice and glinting dully under the dark, freezing water, was the unmistakable heavy steel hilt of the missing survival knife. Hamish stared at the glint of steel beneath the dark, rushing water, his breath plumbing in the freezing mist. Fishing a murder weapon out of an icy Highland burn was precisely the sort of strenuous activity he spent his entire career trying to avoid. He glanced up at the steep, frost-rimed bank, then down at Lugs, who was sensibly sitting on a dry patch of gravel, looking completely uninterested in helping. With a heavy sigh that was entirely swallowed by the roar of the water, Hamish balanced himself precariously on a slick boulder and snapped a long, sturdy branch from a dead gorse bush. He leaned out over the churning black water, the bitter cold radiating upward and biting through his heavy police coat. Carefully, methodically, he guided the hooked end of the branch toward the submerged shelf of ice. He didn't want to disturb the blade itself, nor did he want to lose the scrap of yellow fabric. With a deft flick of his wrister movement, born from years of illegally tickling trout out of local streams, snagged the lanyard ring at the base of the knife's hilt. He pulled it up, catching the torn piece of Gore-Tex on the way, and swung both prizes onto the frozen bank. Hamish squatted, ignoring the painful protest of his chilled knees. He pulled a crumpled, transparent plastic bag from his pocketone that had previously held a rather excellent mutton pie from Mrs. Wellington's sharp-hand used a thick clump of dead bracken to nudge the wet items inside. Even through the distorted plastic, the evidence was compelling. The heavy survival knife was a menacing piece of equipment, and dark, rusted smears around the crossguard proved it hadn't just been dropped by accident. The yellow fabric was a jagged triangle, clearly ripped with considerable force from Marcus Thorne's hideous waterproof jacket. Hamish rubbed his chin, a slow, predatory intelligence gleaming in his hazel eyes. The killer had struck Thorne, stolen the knife, and hauled him up into the tree. During the frantic struggle to hoist a dead weight, the killer's handser, perhaps the rope itself, had snagged Thorne's collar, tearing the fabric. The murderer had fled down the hill, clutching the bloody knife and the torn scrap, pausing on the stone bridge to hurl the weapon into the dark water, not realizing the fabric had tangled around the hilt. It was a panicked, sloppy mistake, a city man's mistake. "Right then," Hamish muttered, tucking the plastic bag carefully into the deepest pocket of his greatcoat. "Let's go and make a Sassenach sweat." He scrambled back up the treacherous bank, slipping twice and coating his trousers in a thick layer of freezing mud. When he finally hauled himself over the low stone parapet of the bridge, the fog had grown even denser, reducing the world to a radius of 10 feet. From somewhere high above, on the slopes near the ruined croft, the faint, furious bellowing of DCI Blair echoed through the mist. Blair was undoubtedly still harassing the Heather, entirely convinced he was on the trail of a local mastermind. Hamish felt a brief pang of sympathy for the vegetation, then turned his back on the noise and strolled casually toward the village. The Tommel Castle Hotel remained a beacon of warmth against the creeping gloom. Hamish paused by the kitchen entrance, scraping the worst of the mud from his boots, before ambling through the swinging doors and making his way back to the guest lounge. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly tense. The survival clients were still huddled near the roaring fire, speaking in hushed, nervous whispers. Harrison was slouched in a deep leather armchair, nursing an empty glass and staring blankly into the flames. He looked utterly exhausted, the sharp angles of his face cast in deep, restless shadows. Hamish shuffled across the room, his shoulders drooping, looking for all the world like a man entirely defeated by the cold and his own incompetence. He stopped directly beside Harrison's chair and let out a long, weary groan, pulling off his peaked cap and vigorously scratching his fiery red hair. "It's a terrible business, sir," Hamish drawled, his voice pitched just loud enough for Harrison to hear, but soft enough to sound like a private lament. "Just terrible. Mr. Blair is making an awful mess up on the hill, shouting at the sheep and the shadows." Harrison stiffened, his eyes darting sideways. Has your inspector found anything?" Hamish let a slow, empty smile spread across his face. He leaned in slightly, bringing with him the distinct, sharp scent of freezing river water and damp mud. "Oh, no, sir. Mr. Blair is looking in all the wrong places. But I was just taking a wee stroll down by the Coreyburn Bridge. It's funny what the water washes up when the ice breaks. I found a lovely piece of yellow waterproof fabric snagged in the reeds, and a very large, very bloody hunting knife right beside it." Harrison's face drained of all colour, turning the sickly shade of old parchment. The glass in his hand trembled violently, clinking against his silver ring. Hamish watched the man's knuckles turn bone white, noting the jagged scratch that suddenly looked very much like a rope burn. Hamish continued mildly, entirely ignoring the man's mounting terror. It's sitting safe in my pocket right now. I'll be taking it up to Strathbane tomorrow for the fingerprint lads to look at. A heavy handle like that, it holds onto prints wonderfully, even in the wet. It'll be a grand surprise for whoever threw it over the edge. Harrison let out a sharp, ragged breath that was almost a sob. He stared at Hamish's pocket as if he expected the plastic-wrapped evidence to leap out and seize him by the throat. The rest of the survival group had fallen silent, the crackle of the peat fire the only sound in the high-ceilinged lounge. The thin man's composure was disintegrating like wet cardboard. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors, calculating the distance to the foggy freedom of the promenade. Hamish, however, didn't move an inch. He remained slumped, appearing more interested in a loose thread on his cuff than the trembling suspect before him. He knew that a man like Harrison, driven by the cold calculations of the city, wouldn't be able to stand the psychological weight of a stupid policeman holding the winning hand. "Of course," Hamish added, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost conspiratorial whisper, "Mr. Blair is a very impatient man. He's currently drafting the arrest warrant for Dougal MacCallum. Dougal's a local, you see. Easy to blame. But if that knife has fingerprints that don't belong to a poacher, well, it would be a terrible embarrassment for Strathbane police. They might even think someone was trying to make a fool of them." Harrison licked his dry lips. "Fingerprints? In the water? That's impossible. The current would have washed them clean." Hamish tilted his head, a look of faux academic curiosity crossing his face. "You'd be surprised, sir. These modern survival knives have those textured rubber grips. Very grippy. They trap all sorts of oils and skin cells. And then there's the blood. It congeals in the grooves. My cousin is a lab technician in Glasgow, and he tells me they can find a man's identity in a drop of sweat these days. It was a complete and utter lie Hamish's only cousin in Glasgow was a bus driver with a gambling habit, but it served its purpose beautifully." Harrison's hands began to shake so violently that his empty glass rattled against the side table. He stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floorboards. "I need some air. This room, it's too hot. I'm going for a walk." "In this fog, sir?" Hamish asked, wide-eyed with concern. "You'll lose your way for sure. Why, only last winter, a tourist wandered off the path and wasn't found until the spring thaw. Best stay here by the fire. I'll just go and check if the tea is ready." Hamish didn't go to the kitchen. Instead, he whistled softly for lugs and retreated into the shadows of the hallway that led to the hotel's rear entrance. He knew Harrison's type. The man was a creature of panic disguised as a man of logic. He wouldn't stay put. He would try to retrieve the evidence or, more likely, try to flee before the fingerprint lads arrived from the south. Hamish slipped out into the biting cold of the kitchen courtyard, his movements silent and fluid, the lazy slouch replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a hunter. He didn't have to wait long. Minutes later, the hotel's side door creaked open. Harrison emerged, bundled in a dark overcoat that looked entirely inadequate for the Highland night. He didn't head for the village. He turned toward the stone bridge, where Hamish had claimed to find the knife. The man was moving with a frantic, stumbling gait, his flashlight beam cutting a jagged, desperate path through the swirling white mist. Hamish followed at a distance, lugs trotting silently beside him. The fog acted as a perfect shroud, dampening the sound of Hamish's boots on the frozen turf. As they reached the bridge, Harrison scrambled down the bank, exactly where Hamish had been moments before. He was on his hands and knees, frantically searching the reeds and the edge of the rushing water with his light. "Looking for something, Mr. Harrison?" The voice, coming out of the featureless white void, made Harrison scream. He spun around, losing his balance on the icy rocks and splashing one foot into the freezing burn. He shone his light upward, illuminating Hamish Macbeth standing on the parapet above, looking down like a grim, red-haired spectre. "You Lee!" Harrison shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You didn't find anything." "I looked. I threw it right there, and it's gone. You're just a pathetic, backward little man trying to play detective. I didn't say I left it there, sir," Hamish said calmly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the plastic bag. The heavy hilt of the knife glinted in the beam of Harrison's own flashlight. "I said I found it. And you just told me exactly where you threw it. I believe that's what the city lawyers call a full confession." Harrison stared at the knife, then Hamish. The realization of what he had just done and who he had just done it hit him with the force of a physical blow. The stupid policeman had led him directly into a trap, and he had walked into it with his eyes wide open, his face twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. He realized there were no witnesses, no DCI Blair, and no one to hear a struggle over the roar of the Corrie burn. He began to climb back up the bank, his fingers clawing at the frozen earth, his eyes fixed on the man who had humiliated him. "You think you're so clever," Harrison hissed, his voice trembling with a different kind of energy now. "But who's going to believe a word you say? It's your word against mine, Macbeth, and you're nothing but a local joke." He reached the top of the wall, lunging toward Hamish with a desperation that bypassed reason. But Hamish wasn't a joke. He was a man who spent his days walking the hills, and his nights hauling heavy peat. As Harrison swung a wild, clumsy fist, Hamish stepped aside with the practiced ease of a man dodging a charging ram. He grabbed Harrison's arm, using the man's own momentum to spin him around and pin him firmly against the cold stone of the bridge. "Careful now, sir," Hamish whispered into Harrison's ear, his voice as cold as the loch water. "You've already ruined your Tuesday. Don't make your Wednesday worse." From the village direction, the sound of a heavy vehicle approaching broke the silence. The headlights of a police rover cut through the fog, illuminating the scene in a harsh, flickering strobe. DCI Blair had finally decided to come down from the hill, and for once, his timing was almost helpful. Harrison struggled with the frantic, wiry strength of a man who realized his entire life had just collapsed into a freezing Highland ditch. He twisted in Hamish's iron grip, his expensive overcoat ripping at the shoulder as he tried to throw his weight backward. "Let go of me, you red-haired oaf! You've got nothing. That knife could belong to anyone," he shrieked, his voice cracking against the damp stone of the bridge. But Hamish didn't budge. He simply leaned his weight into the smaller man, pinning him firmly against the parapet while lugs circled them, barking with sharp, rhythmic precision that echoed through the fog like a rhythmic alarm. The headlights of the police rover grew blindingly bright, the engine idling with a heavy mechanical throb as the vehicle lurched to a halt at the edge of the bridge. The driver's door flew open, and DCI Blair practically tumbled out, his face a spectacular bruised purple in the artificial light. He was covered in mud, his trousers were torn at the knee from his earlier mountaineering disasters, and he looked like a man who was ready to arrest the entire village just to regain his dignity. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, marching toward them while Anderson and Higgins scrambled out of the back seats. "What the devil is going on here? I told you to stay in the village and keep your nose out of the way. I've spent 3 hours chasing a ghost through the gorse because of your half-witted directions." Hamish didn't release his hold on Harrison's arm, though he adopted a look of wide-eyed, apologetic distress. "Oh, I am terribly sorry, sir. I was just taking a wee stroll to clear my head when this gentleman here suddenly took a turn for the worse. He seemed awfully upset about the water, sir. Kept talking about knives and Mr. Thorne and how he threw things over the side." Harrison shook his head, his eyes wild. "He's lying. He planted it. He's been harassing me all evening." Blair stomped up to the pair, his breath smelling of frustration and industrial-strength peppermint. He looked from the hysterical Harrison to the placid, mud-spattered Hamish. "Knives? What are you blethering about, Macbeth?" With a slow, deliberate movement, Hamish reached into his pocket and produced the plastic bag containing the heavy steel blade and the scrap of yellow Gore-Tex. He held it up so the rover's headlights caught the rusted dark stains on the hilt. "I found this in the burn, sir, and Mr. Harrison was just kind enough to show me exactly where he stood when he tossed it. He's been telling me all about his troubles with Mr. Thorne's finances. It seems the authentic Highland business wasn't quite as profitable as they'd hoped." Blair's eyes widened as he processed the sight of the weapon. For a moment, the silence was absolute, save for the rush of the water below. Blair hated Hamish with a passion that bordered on the religious, but he loved a closed case even more. He could see the headlines now of brilliant detective from Strathbane cracking the case within hours of arrival. He looked at Harrison's scratched knuckles and the torn fabric in the bag, then back at the terrified man pinned against the stone. "Is that so?" Blair purred, his voice dropping from a roar to a predatory growl. He approached, crowding into Harrison's personal space. "So, you thought you'd come up here and settle your accounts with a bit of rope and a blade, did you? Thought the local police were too stupid to notice a city man's handiwork." I didn't mean to." Harrison crumbled, the fight leaving him as suddenly as a popped balloon. He slumped against the bridge, his knees buckling. "He stole everything. My savings, my pension. He laughed at me. He said the law couldn't touch him here in the middle of nowhere." I just wanted to scare him, but he fought back, and then the rope was right there. Take him, Blair snapped to Anderson and Higgins, his chest swelling with unearned pride. Cuff him and get him in the back of the van. And make sure you record every word of that confession. I want this wrapped up before the press hears a whisper of it. As the detectives dragged the sobbing Harrison away, Blair turned his attention back to Hamish. He looked the tall constable up and down, his lip curling in a sneer of pure resentment. He knew deep down that the peasant had done the work while Head been shouting at sheep, and the realization tasted like ash. As for you, Macbeth, Blair growled, poking a thick finger into Hamish's chest, you've made a mess of this, disturbing evidence, conducting unauthorized interrogations, and nearly losing the prime suspect in the fog. If I find one single procedural error in your report, I'll have your stripes. You're lucky I am here to fix your blunders. Aye, sir, Hamish said softly, his face a mask of humble gratitude. I don't know what we'd do without your leadership, sir. It's a grand thing to have a real detective on the scene. Blair snorted, adjusted his tie, and marched back to his vehicle without another word. The rover roared into life and sped away toward the village, leaving Hamish and Luggs alone in the swirling, silent white. The constable stood on the bridge for a long moment, listening to the fading sound of the siren, a small, tired smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. He had the weapon, he had the killer, and most importantly, he had a superior officer who was more than happy to steal the credit. The following morning, the sun rose over a Loch Dubh that had been scrubbed clean by a sharp Atlantic breeze. The stifling fog had vanished, leaving the peaks of the mountains dusted with a fresh, innocent layer of snow. In the village, life had already resumed its slow, rhythmic pulse. The postman made his rounds with an extra spring in his step, and the smoke from the chimneys drifted straight and true into a pale blue sky. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the scent of frying bacon and strong coffee. Hamish sat by the peat stove, his boots propped up on a wooden crate, watching as Luggs lazily chased a dream through a series of muffled yaps. The radio on the desk crackled to life, the frantic, self-important voice of a reporter from the Strathbane Sentinel demanding an interview with the hero of the Highlands. Hamish didn't reach for the receiver. Instead, he turned the volume down until the voice was nothing more than a faint, annoying buzz. A shadow fell across the frosted window, followed by the familiar, heavy tread of DCI Blair. The door swung open, and the inspector marched in, looking remarkably smug in a fresh suit, his chest puffed out like a prize-winning pouter pigeon. "Macbeth!" Blair barked, though the usual venom was replaced by a sort of oily triumph. "I've just come from the press briefing. The super is delighted. A clean sweep. Harrison is singing like a canary, and the fiscal is already preparing the indictment. It's a textbook example of high-level criminal profiling and tactical pursuit." Hamish looked up, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. "Is that a fact, sir? My, you must have worked a miracle up on that hill. I was telling Mrs. Wellington only this morning that I've never seen a man navigate a Highland bog with such authority." Blair preened, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the station's dark window. "It's a matter of experience, Macbeth. Something Yow'd do well to study. I've put a word in with the chief constable. I told him that while you were present, the CID team handled the heavy lifting. I suggested that a promotion for you at this stage would be premature. You lack the killer instinct for the big city." Hamish let out a long, theatrical sigh of disappointment, though his heart was singing. "If you say so, sir. I suppose he'll just have to stay here and keep an eye on the sheep. It's a heavy burden being so inadequate." "Quite," Blair snapped, already turning toward the door. "Try not to let the station burn down while I am gone. I have a television interview in Inverness at 2. As the police rover roared away, Hamish stood up and stretched, his long limbs popping in the warmth of the room. He walked to the window and watched the car disappear around the bend of the loch. He was safe. There would be no transfer to a grey, concrete office in Glasgow, no endless paperwork in a windowless room, and no need to wear a suit that itched. He was still the lazy, useless constable of Loch Dubh, exactly as he wished to be. The door jingled again, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped in, carrying a small wicker basket. She looked at Hamish, her eyes sparkling with a knowing, cynical light. "I saw the inspector leaving. He looked like Head just conquered Gaul. He's a very brave man, Priscilla," Hamish drawled, reaching into the basket and pulling out a warm, buttery croissant. "Save me from myself," he did. "I am far too stupid for the CID, or so I've been told." Priscilla leaned against the desk, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You're the most dangerous man in Scotland, Hamish Macbeth." and the most honest liar I've ever met." "I don't know what you mean," Hamish said, his mouth full of pastry. He walked to the door and looked out over the sparkling waters of the loch. A salmon leaped in the distance, a silver arc against the blue, and Hamish's hand instinctively twitched toward the poaching wire in his pocket. The peace of the Highlands had been restored, the outsider had been dealt with, and for the first time in days, the air felt perfectly clear. "Come on, lugs," Hamish murmured, whistling for the dog. "The sun is out, the hills are calling, and I believe I have a very important appointment with a folding chair and a fishing rod." He stepped out into the crisp morning air, closing the station door behind him. The mystery of the Maclean Croft was over, leaving behind nothing but a story for the locals to chew on over their whisky. Hamish Macbeth began his slow, shambling walk toward the heather, a man entirely content with his own quiet deceptions, disappearing into the vast, beautiful indifference of the mountains.